So two Thursdays ago, I took our kids to school. They just go down to Westside Elementary, and it's about a 2-minute drive from me. And so I drove down, dropped them off, came back, and as I got out of the van, I smelled something hot. And I thought, well, what is that? So I walked to the front of our yard just to see if someone was burning something in the neighborhood, and it kind of faded, so I walked back, and then I realized, I think that's my van. And so I looked in the back. One of the back tires was literally smoking. And I'm not a mechanic, but I'm going to guess that's not good. So I drove it down to the dealership, and they called later that day, and they said, Jason, you need a new caliper, you need a new rotor, and you need a new brake line. Awesome. Merry Christmas to us. We're expecting to take that van to Kentucky for Christmas, and thankfully, Derek and Natalie graciously let us borrow their van this past week for our travels. So that's a small public thank you to them. They're good people, but that's just the way life is, right? We're either thanks. We're either. I was like, is it? Is anyone going to respond to that rhetorical question? We're either walking into a mess or we're walking out of one. So to be honest, it is difficult for us to think about praise and worship this morning when our lives are so full of busyness and chaotic schedules. It's difficult for us to think about praise and worship when we're constantly dealing with distractions of disappointments and curveballs that we did not expect to see. And the reality is that Jesus is born into something like that. So we sing Silent Night around this time of year, but it was a chaotic night. The God-man Jesus enters into time and space in a volatile and dangerous point in history. So he's surrounded by people that love him, but he's also surrounded by people that want him dead. And in the chaos of his birth, there's this posture of praise that just rings out across Bethlehem. So it's been about a year or two after the birth of Jesus when the wise men come to visit. You might know them as the Magi. You might know them as the three kings, but I want to show us the biblical story of these men and how their hearts were thrown into a posture of praise by the birth of the King of the Jews. So here's your main point, and we'll work from there. The main point is this: the birth of Jesus causes a heart of praise. The birth of Jesus causes a heart of praise. This morning we're going to be in Matthew chapter 2. If you have a digital Bible, I'll be out of the ESV. If you have notes, all the main scriptures on the back. The birth of Jesus, it causes a heart of praise. I'm going to start in verse 1 of chapter 2. We'll read the whole narrative, pray, and then walk through the notes together. So this is Matthew 2, starting in verse 1, it says, Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him. And when Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all of Jerusalem with him. And assembling all the chief priests and the scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Christ were to be born. And they told him, In Bethlehem of Judea. For so it is written by the prophet, And you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall become a ruler who will be shepherd of my people Israel. And then Herod, he summoned the wise men secretly and ascertained them from the time the star had appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word that I might too come and worship him. And after listening to the king, they went their own way. And behold, the star that they had seen when it rose before them until it came to rest over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And going into the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother, and they fell down and worshipped him. Then, opening their treasures, they offered him gifts, gold and frankincense and myrrh. And being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed to their own country by another way. Let's pray. Worship. As we walk through the story of the wise men, I want to give us 5 truths about worship that we'll see in the text. And the first one is this, is that worship is initiated by God. So if you're taking notes, that's the first one. 5 truths about worship. Worship is initiated by God. We're going to start again in verse 1 of chapter 2. Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." So in the first few verses, we are given the background and the characters of the narrative. The text mentions that Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea. As mentioned earlier, it's about a year or two after his own birth. Jesus, he's no longer in the manger. Mary and Joseph, they're dwelling in a house in Bethlehem, so there's no wise men in the nativity scene. And our text takes us to the landscape of Bethlehem. Bethlehem, it's called City of David because King David was born in this town. By the time Jesus was born, Bethlehem, it's a small village about 5 miles outside of Jerusalem. The family had landed in Bethlehem after Caesar Augustus issued a census decree. And so since Joseph was born from Bethlehem, the family traveled there, and then Jesus was born. So we're in the village of Bethlehem during the days of Herod the king. Herod, also known as King Herod the Great, he's not the best guy around, okay, just as a heads up. Okay, he's known as a shrewd politician, a great soldier, a powerful communicator, a skillful builder. He also had many sons and wives that were close to him that he murdered because he was fearful that they might take over his kingship. Caesar Augustus actually said that he would rather be one of Herod's pigs than one of Herod's sons. So not the best guy around. Says a lot about a person. So we have Jesus, we have Herod, and we have a wise men that have entered the scene. The wise men, they're also known as kings, which is probably not true, or magi because of their close connection with Eastern magic and their scientific study of astrology. Scripture doesn't actually say that there's 3 of them, and we can guess from the text that there's many more. These wise men, they come from the east, likely the Babylonian region. Maybe they even heard about the prophecy of the Messiah when the Jews were held captive in exile in Babylon. Regardless, we know for sure these men were Gentiles. They're not Jewish. Okay, they did not grow up in the Jewish faith. They were not viewed as part of the family of God. They were Gentiles. They're foreigners. They're unclean. And these wise men saw a star rising in the sky over Jerusalem. They've traveled from afar, and they're asking those in town, "Where is the King of the Jews? Where is the King of the Jews? We saw the star, and we have come to worship him." Like, what a profound picture that the birth of Jesus was proclaimed to some unclean shepherds in the field. We saw that last week. And the birth of Jesus was proclaimed to some unclean foreigners from afar. These men have come to worship Jesus. So the first truth about worship, as we see in the story, is that worship is initiated by God. This is John 4:23. It'll be on the screen. But the hour is coming and is now here when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth, for the Father is seeking such people to worship him. See, before the wise men ever sought out God in the flesh, God sought out the wise men. And so a star was shot into the sky over Jerusalem. It's the supernatural and divine event. It's a calling out of those that have waited this moment. The Father is seeking out true worshipers, and ironically, those worshipers happen to be foreign Gentiles arriving from the east. This is Isaiah 43, 5-7. I only added this as just the supernatural intervention of God. As I was driving here this morning, listening to a podcast, and the guy quoted this. I thought, this is perfect. This is exactly where the text is going. Isaiah 43. Fear not, for I am with you, and I will bring your offspring from the east and from the west, and I will gather you. And I will say to the north, give up, and to the south, do not withhold. Bring my sons from afar, and my daughters from the end of the earth. Everyone who is called by my name, whom I created for my glory, whom I formed and made. God is not seeking out the religious elite. God is not seeking out men and women with authority and power. God is not seeking out people with a perfect history and a clean rap sheet. God is not seeking out men and women that have all the answers in life figured out. God is seeking out true worshipers. God is seeking out men and women that will recognize Jesus as king. And if he can't find that in Jerusalem, then he's going to find it from some guys out in the east. Worship is initiated by God, and God is looking for true worshipers this morning. So this morning, are you someone the Father is seeking for in worship? God has initiated the call to worship, and he is looking for people in this room to be true worshipers and to worship him in spirit and truth. And that's what we find from the wise men in the narrative. Worship is initiated by God. But secondly, this. Worship creates unity and division. Now, we love to talk about the first one. We don't really talk much about the second one. Worship creates unity and division. Look at verse 3. When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him, and assembling all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. And they told him, in Bethlehem of Judea. For so it is written by the prophet, and you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. And then Herod summoned the wise men secretly and ascertained from them what time the star had appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, go and search diligently for the child. When you have found him, bring me word, that I too may come and worship him. Worship creates unity and division. The wise men, they've made it to Jerusalem. And they're asking those in town, where is the child that is king of the Jews? We're here to worship him. And who catches wind that these men are in town? That's not rhetorical this time. Herod, right? Can you imagine the thoughts swirling in Herod's head? He is King Herod. He's King Herod the Great. He's risen to power. He's built up political systems. He's managed both the Romans and the Jews in the area. He has killed men and women that have even positioned themselves to overthrow his authority. And now he catches wind that there are foreigners in the land that are asking about a king of the Jews that has been born. His mind must have broke with confusion and anger. He was king of the land. Like the Jews, they reported to him. And so Herod, he gathers his people together for a huddle. And he begins to question them on the rumors that he has heard around town. So all the chief priests gathered, and all the scribes he gathered together. Where is the Christ that has been born? His question is a little interesting. See, the wise men, they're asking for the king of the Jews, but Herod was at least wise enough to know that it was the Christ child. Where has the Christ been born? And he asked the Jewish chief priests and scribes, and they immediately respond, in Bethlehem of Judea. So how did these chief priests and scribes know that? Well, because they knew the scriptures better than fake King Herod. How do they know where Jesus was to be born? Because it was a spoken prophecy in Micah 5:2. It'll be on the screen. But you, O Bethlehem of Ephrathah, who are too little to be among the clans of Judah, for you shall come forth for me one who is the ruler in Israel, whose coming forth is from of old, from ancient of days. So Herod, he's beginning to connect the dots of the events that have happened and will unfold. And he summons the wise men to himself for questioning. It's a leadership flex to track down foreigners in Jerusalem and then bring them in for questioning. Herod had scary power in the land. The men come to him, and he questions them about the timing of the star. And interestingly enough, he sends them to Bethlehem to search for the child. I didn't really see that for so many years. Meaning God used wicked Herod to point Gentile worshipers to worship Jesus. I love that. God is in the control of the mess of broken people. God often uses evil intentions of people to bring himself glory. Even when things are dark, God is in control of the situation. King Herod has a plan, but God's plan is greater. So King Herod, he says to the men, when you find this boy, return and tell me where he is so I can worship him too. That's an obvious lie. Herod has no intention of worshiping Jesus. Herod has every intention of killing the child. We see his bloodthirsty heart in Matthew 2:16. You can see it later in the text. Then Herod, when he saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, became furious. And he sent and killed all male children in Bethlehem and in all that region who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had ascertained from the wise men. The worship of Jesus has and always will on this earth bring unity, but it will also bring division. We see that clearly in the text in so many ways, that the worship of Jesus, it brings people from all different races and backgrounds together under the headship of Christ. See, worship, it has this magnetic pull to bring praise and honor to the King of all kings. It's a drawing of Jews and Gentiles together to worship God as one family. It's a drawing of the Eastern Gentiles from a different land to worship at the feet of Jesus. Ephesians 2:14, it says, "For he himself is our peace, who has made us both one and has broken down in his flesh the dividing wall of hostility." Christ is our peace and has broken down the dividing wall of hostility among the nations. We worship as one body, unified under the name of Jesus. See, worship creates this powerful, unifying reality for the people of God. So what we are doing here this morning, it should be unique to what the world has. But let's not be naive. Worship, it certainly creates division, right? And I want to be clear, the division of worship that is happening in the text is not centered around music. Isn't that weird? It's worship all over the text, nothing to do with music. Churches go crazy over music preferences. And I want to be brutally honest about that. You ready? The reason we are so divided over worship music is that we have made worship about music and not about Jesus. The wise men came to worship Jesus, and there's no music involved. Like, they didn't stand around the house debating if that little kid playing the drum for Jesus was good. And he wasn't there, and let's be real, that's a terrible song, but we'll ignore that. There's no music in this narrative. The division that worship creates among people is centered around Jesus himself. That's why King Herod is so upset. Like, we all have music preferences. I have them too. I'm very picky about music and the way that it's played. I like things a certain way. I can go around this room and ask each of you, what kind of music do you like? And I promise every person in this room, those answers would be all across the board. But worship is not about music, it's about Jesus. Music is just often a vehicle for us to get there. Worship creates division because it causes us to choose whether Jesus is king of our lives or if he's not. Worship creates unity and division. And thirdly, this. Worship causes joy in the expectation. Worship causes joy in the expectation. Verse 9. After listening to the king, they went on their way. And behold, the star that they had seen when it rose went before them until it came to rest over the place where the child was. And when they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. The star in the sky has re-entered the story. The wise men, they head to Bethlehem, but it appears that the star has moved to rest over the exact location of the house of Jesus. And when they see the star, the text says that they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. It's affirmation of the angel's proclamation to the shepherds from last week. An angel said to them, "Fear not, for behold, I bring you good news of great joy that will be for all people." The news that Jesus has been born causes great joy for all people, including Gentiles from the east. They rejoice with great joy when they see the star again resting over the house of the child. See, worship, it causes joy in the expectation. There was much joy and rejoicing even before they entered the house. They were ready and expectant to see Christ. So we don't have a star hanging over the church each week, but that shouldn't stop our joy as we look forward to worshiping Jesus. True worshipers are expectant in their worship. So we expect God to speak to us. Not in some superficial feelings, but by the power of his word. And we sing praises that will fill the building. We expect God to fulfill the promise of salvation in our lives. We expect God to one day resurrect our bodies in eternity without struggles or pain or tears. True worshipers look forward, rejoicing and full of joy. In the simplest example, do we look forward to gathering together on a Sunday like that? It's not just for you, it's for me too. True worshipers are rejoicing before they ever walk through those doors. That doesn't mean that we come in here with a smile on our face. We might come in here with deep brokenness, but we're expecting to have an interaction with God. This is a challenge to you and myself, okay? When we wake up on a Sunday morning, just try praying an honest prayer. God, would you stir in my mind joy as I look forward to church this morning? God, I'm asking and expecting that you will speak to me according to your word. See, church, it will always be boring if you expect nothing out of it. Church comes alive when we expect God to speak to us in his word as we gather. East River Park is not going to put together a circus on the stage in hopes that we can keep your attention. That's just not what we're about. Okay, we don't need a circus. We need God to speak to us. So pray for it. Expect it. Allow it to cause a rejoicing in your heart and in your mind. Worship causes joy in the expectation. We are here for the name of Jesus. And fourthly, this. Worship changes our posture. Worship changes our posture. So we'll look at the first half of verse 11. And going into the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they fell down and worshiped him. The wise men finally arrive at the house, and as they enter, they see the child and his mother Mary. And what do? Well, they tell everyone in the house about their journey to Bethlehem. They explain to Mary about the star in the sky. They share about their experience with King Herod. Nope, they don't do any of that. We don't know what they said in that house. We just know what they did. They fall down and worship Jesus. Because worship is far more about what you do rather than what you say. True worshipers are not found with how well they can run their mouth about religious things. True worshipers are found in their actions. So these men fell down in that house before the child. Like, just seriously, stop and picture that scene. These are foreign diplomats from the East. They're educated, they're powerful, they're wealthy men, and we see them in the village of Bethlehem falling at the feet of Jesus, who's no more than 2 years old. It's this profound and haunting picture. The wise men have found the child. They have found the King of the Jews. They have found the Christ to be worshipped, and they fall to the ground. Worship, it changes our posture. Matthew 15 says, "You hypocrites. Well, did Isaiah prophesy of you when he said, 'This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men.'" See, worship has far more to do with the posture of our heart than the words that come out of our mouth. God wants our hearts in worship. Our hearts must submit to the rule of Christ in our life. When we worship here this morning or throughout your week, our heart posture must be, "Jesus, you're my greatest desire. Jesus, you alone can satisfy what my heart craves." It is a posture of the heart that drove these wise men to their knees. This child overwhelmed them and forced a change of posture. So we don't kneel and worship because we like the song. We kneel and worship because we're overwhelmed with Christ. And we don't raise our hands in worship because we're feeling emotional. We raise our hands in worship because we're overwhelmed with Christ. Worship has a way of changing our physical posture, but it first must change the posture of our heart. And lastly, this, 5. Worship is costly. Worship is costly. I'll finish verse 11 in the narrative. Halfway through verse 11 it says, "Then opening their treasures, they offered him gifts, gold and frankincense and myrrh. And being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed to their own country by another way." This is the part of the story where we get the 3 wise men or 3 kings. So we just wrongly assume that because there's 3 gifts that we must have 3 men at the scene. And honestly, we don't know how many guys are there. At the very least, there was enough guys to cause a stir back in Jerusalem. Regardless, we have these men fall down and worship the child, and then they present 3 gifts for Jesus: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Now, I don't think these gifts symbolize anything worth mentioning, because we see no confirmation of that symbolism in the Bible. Here's what I do know about the gifts. They were gifts for a king, and they were costly. They were gifts for a king, and they were costly. The wise men did not show up with cheap gifts for worship. They didn't hit up the local gift shop in Jerusalem on the way to Bethlehem. They're costly gifts fit for a king. And the last truth about worship is that worship is costly. We don't come to worship Jesus empty-handed. It is wrong thinking to believe that any of this is free. To worship Jesus is costly. It'll cost your time. The wise men didn't hop on a plane and fly over to Jerusalem. They didn't Uber their way to Bethlehem. These men gave up a serious amount of time to be able to fall at the feet of Jesus. And your greatest and most precious commodity is your time, is it not? You can make more money. You cannot make more time. And the cost of worshiping Jesus is a time commitment. It is intentional and focused worship that cost the wise men and us our time. So they weren't cleaning dishes or mowing the lawn and worshiping Jesus. And not to say that can't happen, but what we see in the text is something far more focused. It will cost our time. It will cost our cash. These gifts were not free or cheap. Worship cost money. Financial giving is an act of worship and a practical part of worship. So 1 Corinthians chapter 16, now concerning the collection for the saints, as I directed the church of Galatia, so you also are to do. On the first day of every week, each of you is to put something aside and store it up as he may prosper, so there will be no collecting when I come. Paul is speaking about the financial collection for the church to operate and do the work of the ministry. So worship is not free, nor spiritually, nor practically. So this isn't some weird Ponzi scheme where I'm trying to get rich. The act of worship is that it costs something that we're trying to actively live out. Like at this point in my life, it is not easy for me to financially give to this church. It's not. Okay, we have student loan debt and we have 3 little kids to feed. But I give financially to this church anyway. I believe in what we're doing. It's an act of worship that is costly for me and for all of us. It will cost your cash, and lastly, it will cost your life. I'm sure the wise men, they didn't see that one coming. But the child would grow up to be the king of his own kingdom. The child would grow up and be crucified on a cross. Jesus will die, and 3 days later, Jesus will rise from the dead. Matthew 16. Then Jesus told his disciples, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul? Or what shall a man give in return for his soul? The cost of worship is our own life. Like it's everything. The cost is great. Don't let anyone fool you into thinking this is free and easy. We are men and women that deny ourselves of all our own dreams and desires for this world, and then we take up our cross and we follow Jesus. That's true worship. Worship is costly because we have laid down all that we have at the feet of Jesus. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, he was a German theologian that was executed by the Nazi regime for plotting to overthrow Adolf Hitler. And he wrote this book, The Cost of Discipleship. It gives us a glimpse of the cost of worshiping Jesus as King of our lives. This is what he says. Costly grace is the gospel which must be sought again and again and again, the gift which must be asked for, the door at which a man must knock. Such grace is costly because it calls us all to follow. And it is grace because it calls us to follow Jesus Christ. It is costly because it costs a man his life. And it is grace because it gives a man the only true life. It is costly because it condemns sin. And grace because it justifies the sinner. And above all, it is costly because it cost God the life of his Son. You were bought at a price. And what has cost God much cannot be cheap for us. Above all, it is grace because God did not reckon his Son too dear a price to pay for our life, but delivered him up for us. Costly grace is the incarnation of God. The cost of worshiping Jesus is everything. It is your life. And the birth of Jesus, it shakes awake our worship of the Creator. The birth of Jesus, it causes us to have a heart of praise. Worship that's initiated by God. Worship that creates unity and division. Worship that causes joy in the expectation. Worship that changes our posture, and worship that is costly. Let's pray.